Economies follow a pattern: booms and busts. And if we're coming out of the golden age of anime and a period of substantial economic growth in the 1980s, you can guess what's about to come next. The 1990s kick off what has come to be known as the lost decade or decades in Japan, a prolonged period of economic stagnation that stands in stark contrast to the growth that it had recently experienced. Considering the large positive impact that a prosperous economy appeared to have on the anime industry in the 80s, it would make sense that the inverse would hold true as well. However, as counterintuitive as it may seem, things weren't all bad for the anime industry in the 1990s, despite Japan's struggling economy, and there were still some incredibly popular and successful projects that were released during this period. Today, we'll be taking a look at how Japan's economic collapse reshaped the anime industry. If you were an outside observer of Japan during the late 80s, it would be pretty hard to believe that this economic machine would grind to a halt in just a few years. Japan went from easily outpacing the United States and European Union to falling well behind both of them, with their average annual GDP growth falling from 4.33% in the 80s to just 1.48% during the next decade. A decade that included 3 years of negative GDP growth, when the 80s' worst performing year was a growth rate of 2.82%. So what happened to cause such a dramatic shift? In short, it was the popping of Japan's asset bubble. But how did this bubble form in the first place? Some of the commonly cited reasons for the emergence of the bubble are overly aggressive activity by financial institutions, poor risk management by financial institutions, decreased financial regulations, the Plaza Accord, a long period of quantitative easing, government policies pushing up land prices, overconfidence in the market, concentrating economic activity in Tokyo, and Tokyo becoming an international hub for finance. Side note, quantitative easing, or QE, is a monetary policy used by central banks. Banks would buy securities like government and corporate bonds in order to increase the amount of money in circulation and lower interest rates. If you watched the last episode of Anime Economics, you may have noticed that some of these things also appear to have contributed to Japan's growth in the 80s. The Plaza Accord increased the value of the yen, giving people in Japan more purchasing power, and the more money flowing through the Japanese economy encouraged banks to lend and companies to invest. But problems started to arise during what economists at the Bank of Japan call the bubble period, between 1987 and 1990. It was given this name because this period of time had three things happening simultaneously, according to a paper by Shigenori Shiratsuga, a professor of economics at Keio University. Those three things were a marked increase in asset prices, an expansion in monetary aggregates and credit, and an overheating economy. The cause of the increase in asset prices was the large amount of money in circulation. Corporations used money that they borrowed to purchase large amounts of land in Tokyo. With so much money pouring in, prices skyrocketed. Tokyo land prices rose by 10.4% in 1986, 57.5% in 1987, and 22.6% in 1988. And these price increases spread to all parts of Tokyo's real estate market, residential, industrial, and commercial sectors. Even though corporations saw the value of their assets appreciate significantly over the bubble period, they were able to leverage these profits into even more cash. They were able to do this because Japanese banks were accepting real estate as collateral for 80% or more of its market value. This, combined with already low interest rates, increased the amount of capital corporations had access to even more. And there were other ways for companies to obtain credit, because banks were also letting them use stock portfolios as collateral as well. Rising land prices not only increased the amount of capital available to businesses, but to landlords and homeowners as well, because they could take out loans of their increasingly valuable property to invest in the stock market.
Oh, that period was sheer madness. All these foreign securities firms, realizing that Japan is there to explore, came in and start buying prime real estate at ridiculous prices. And then the average Japanese looking at that and says, gee, if these foreign securities houses think the real estate is worth so much, maybe it is worth so much.
So many people are building the large skyscrapers. People are very much sure of the future, and everybody thought that they're going to become rich.
Because of regulations and low interest rates at the time. If they weren't investing overseas, businesses didn't have many other options other than dumping more money into the Tokyo Stock Exchange, alongside speculative private investors. And this led to a massive increase in the value of Japanese stocks. During this period, 70% of large Japanese corporate equities were owned by large Japanese corporations, according to the Harvard Business Review. Although operating profits were quite good for many of the principal Japanese corporations in 1987 and 1988, a look at the price-to-earnings ratios of the Tokyo Stock Exchange indicates that it wasn't only the basic business performance of listed companies that was bringing in investors, it was land money, which created a kind of double leveraging of the land itself. Capital value reflected in land prices and in share prices, the latter realized as cash through the liquidity that land speculating had created. And of course, the more capital acquired by corporations in the stock market, the more available to them for further non-operating investment, such as more land. The Japanese had created sort of a never-ending circle. This never-ending circle could continue as long as asset prices continued to rise. However, since most of the growth was tied to the price of these assets, if they were to lose their value, the results would be catastrophic. In fact, a drop in asset prices would have a much stronger effect on the economy than if prices rose, according to Shigenori Sharitsuka. The effect of asset price fluctuations is asymmetric, with a stronger effect in the case of an asset price decline, because the collapse in asset prices has adverse effects on the stability of the financial system. Changes in cash flow and asset prices arising from cyclical movements in firms' net worth tend to affect agency cost and credit conditions, thereby influencing firms' investment behavior. The Bank of Japan was aware of the risk of a bubble forming, but didn't take any meaningful action to stop it until 1989, when they started incrementally raising interest rates in May and continued to raise them into 1990. Initially, things didn't change very much. The Nikkei 225, a stock market index for the Tokyo Stock Exchange, actually hit an all-time high of 38,957.44 yen per share on December 29, 1989. But as interest rates continued to increase, the bubble popped. The Nikkei 225 lost 35% of its value in 1990 alone, falling from 37,189 yen on January 4th to 23,849 yen on December 28th. Land prices peaked in September of 1990 at a level that was 4 times greater than what they were just 5 years before, and continued to decline from there. And in 1999, land prices were 20% less than they had been in September of 1985, and 80% less than they were at their peak. The impact of the asset bubble popping was wide-reaching. People were underwater on their mortgages, and now they had to deal with deflation, money was a lot harder for businesses to obtain, and banks had to be bailed out. We've seen bubbles burst before, but what made this one different?
It's a massive asset bubble crash. It's a stock market crash. And we've seen similar ones since, going through Asia, like the one in 2008 that led to a global kind of recession. But I think in this particular case, it was highly localized to Japan. And so the bubble economy bursting sent Japan into a depression, or a recession at least, that has lasted for decades. And there are, sort of notes of positivity in there, and notes of, it's not a disaster for everyone when the stock market goes down. Some people do very well out of it. We see greater amounts of conglomeration for, particularly in my subject area, the media industries. But we also see, when that asset bubble bursts, the youth of Japan really suffering in terms of the job market. And that's probably the bit, I think, in terms of the long-standing implications of the bubble economy crashing, that's been the biggest, most obvious result for the Japanese people, has been the sudden lack of access to jobs for young people. And that's been fundamentally changing the job market in Japan. So it used to be that you would go through school, you'd do your entrance exam for university, and depending on where you went to university, you could get a job in a big company, and that would be your job pretty much for life if you wanted it to be. And nowadays it's a much more kind of flexibly oriented market, and it's much harder, particularly for young people, to get into those careers. And moreover, young people are feeling, I think, this is very, very generalized, but I think young people in particular have become more disaffected. So it's harder for young people to get into the job market, and that makes it harder for them to do things like buy their own apartments and houses and get married and have kids. And so there's been huge ramifications for the bubble economy collapsing that are still a hallmark of Japan today in its aging society.
Japan's unemployment rate increased through the 1990s and didn't start to decrease until it peaked at 5.5% in August of 2002. At the same time, the average citizen wasn't as well off as they were before, with the average household losing 0.39% of their net worth every year from 1991 to 2003, due in large part to the crashing value of lands and stocks. So things weren't looking great in Japan at the time, for both businesses and citizens. But how did all of this affect the anime industry? One of the most immediate impacts was the closure of several studios, but this didn't have as big of an impact as you might expect. And the studios that survived would shape the anime industry into what it is today.
My understanding is that most of the studios that shut down at the time were small-time studios that primarily produced OVAs, and all the big anime studios survived the recession, and some even flourished.
It is a hugely mixed picture in the 1990s. One of the really interesting things that happens in the 1990s, I think for me, is you get a kind of commercialization of the market that's not that dissimilar to what happens around Hollywood cinema. So in the 1990s, you get massive blockbuster success stories like Studio Ghibli, where their films are breaking box office records across that decade. But at the same time, at the lower end of the market, you see studios struggling to keep up. And it's those big studios, those ones that get investment from publishers, they get investment from big conglomerates that tend to weather the storms more easily. But that aside, there's also smart studios that are doing a huge amount of work, like something like Studio 4C, where what they do is just kind of retrench and consolidate so they can grow again when things are good. So there's different responses to the economic pressures in that period. And it's a period in which anime becomes, I guess, in response to the pressure that a lot of these companies are under, it becomes in some ways much more oriented towards fans. It becomes more oriented towards genres and more, I guess, attentive to the needs of the market. So in some ways, it's where anime really comes into its own. Lest we forget, the 1990s also gives us Neon Genesis Evangelion and the kind of coming of age of anime. So it's no longer just for kids and teenagers, it's for everyone. It's for grown-ups, it's for older children. And despite all the problems in Japanese society, anime is kind of finding ways to tell new kinds of stories that will speak to people, which is, I think, hugely important for the medium in Japan.
But even if most of the large studios survived, money wasn't as easy to come by. So did the quality of animation decrease to a noticeable degree because of budget restrictions?
During the time, the answer is no. That's the short answer. And the reason for that is because most of the anime that was making it to the United States were the larger budget productions, movies like, Akira and Ghost in the Shell and Ninja Scroll and Pat Labor 2. And then as far as shows, you saw Neon Genesis Evangelion get brought over in the late 90s. So those were the types of shows that were being brought over at the time. So it wasn't really noticeable. But now that we have a lot more access to anime and you can, watch any show on simulcast practically and also go back and watch a lot of the shows, it's a lot more clear, the impact.
Even if budgets were lower, studios still managed to produce some incredibly popular and influential series. For example, Sailor Moon, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, Slayers, Rurouni Kenshin, and more, all came out in the 90s. So how did they pull it off?
I mean, there's kind of two really clear answers, like two really obvious ways things were being done. So one of them was to buy into or to bid for, so animation studios would bid for the rights to produce anime series based on popular manga. So things like the Shonen Jump properties were hugely popular. So you get things like One Piece and you get Detective Conan from another magazine. You get all these kind of really big franchises taking off in the 1980s into the 1990s. They will have 52 episodes, so like weekly, one a week for a year. Then they'll have a spin-off film, a Gekijoban or theatrical version of the TV show. And so that's a really stable model of production for some of these studios. And that's one way that some of these studios kept afloat across the 1990s. And that's very much the commercial popular end of the market. Now, some of the things you're describing, like Cowboy Bebop, and maybe you put films in there like Ghost in the Shell, which comes out in like 1995. These are much more risky propositions, even though some of them have manga origins. I think you have to spend a lot more money when you're making a standalone film because you have to bring together all the crew and the producers and the directors to make it. And something like Cowboy Bebop, which is a very short run series. It's not something that lasts 52 episodes. It's much shorter than that. So some of these are indications of the market changing a little bit. It's an indication of the importance of home video in this period. So being able to not just put it on TV, but to put it on DVDs and sell it repeatedly to fans. I think those are major ways that anime changes in this period in the 1990s in response to the bubble economy. is it doubles down on the growing group of more adult-oriented, still relatively well-off fans that it has. And unless we forget, this is also kind of the joke that Studio Gainax is making when it makes its Otaku no Video short OVA, where they talk about the market and the fans and what fans do and how fans collect. So even the animation studios are getting in on this joke, and they know their fans, they know their market really well. So I think that's part. So you've got kind of two sides of the same coin there. One, the kind of more kind of stable commercial base for animation becoming ingrained in the way anime works in Japan, but also where things are a little more experimental, a little more risky, or a little more short-lived. You also get a doubling down on pre-existing markets, genres. So sci-fi, in the case of Cowboy Bebop, is a really popular genre for manga and anime. So you get these kind of tested markets, and they tend to be also associated with big name or rising star directors and creators. So people the fans will know and will be willing to buy into as well. So there's a star economy that is always important to anime and manga, but which becomes much, I think, maybe a little more visible in the 1990s as well.
Speaking of Otaku no Video, the otaku subculture started to take shape in Japan in the 1980s, even if it didn't exactly have the best reputation. It started to slowly make its way overseas and was accelerated by the release of Otaku no Video. However, that didn't mean that the community was especially large at the time.
Communities and fandoms were built around anime and manga, which allowed people to connect and feel a sense of belonging. And I believe this is how the subculture grew and became a targeted demographic. And then to cap it off, you started to see a lot of anime conventions cropping up in Japan during the late 70s. And these were often sponsored by the anime studios. So this helped fan the flames of interest over in Japan specifically. In the United States, this concept caught on early with some people, but not really in the same way it did in Japan. In the United States, the first anime convention was in the early 80s and had a very small turnout. I think it was like 100 people. And you have anime clubs here and there throughout the country, but overall it wasn't on the same level as what you saw in Japan. And it wasn't really until 1991 that the US had an anime convention break 1,000 people in attendance. And then even then, you didn't really start to see large turnouts at American anime conventions until the late 90s and early 2000s. So I would say that it was probably about the early 2000s when you really started to see that take off in the United States.
Even if there weren't a lot of people attending conventions, the 1990s is when anime's popularity in the United States and the United Kingdom started to accelerate. Side note, according to Helen McCarthy, an author of several historical anime and manga reference books, there was already an established market for anime in continental Europe at this time. So most of the explosive growth that we'll be covering is focused on the US and UK.
Anime is international from its roots. So the very first anime adjacent shows being produced by Osamu Tezuka out of Mushi Productions, things like Astro Boy and Jungle Emperor Leo, or Jangoru Taite is the Japanese title. These were in America on American syndicated, they're in syndicates around the fringes of American television right from the 60s onwards. So in some ways, there's never been a time when anime wasn't somewhere in the international market. And Japanese creators in the early days, particularly at Mushi Pro, were relying on the American broadcast rights money to enable them to make their animation. So there's an international element to what's going on with anime right from the beginning. Obviously, the big change across the 1980s and 90s is the development of home video and then DVD. So as DVD booms, anime booms. As VHS booms before that, anime booms again. And it's partly to do with the fact that when you're looking to distribute something, you look for something your market doesn't already have. So as a distributor, you'll be looking at animation and going, what don't we already have a saturated market for? And Japan is sitting there on a cache, an amazing trove of different kinds of animated shows. And there was a grassroots popularity of anime already. So coming through sci-fi conventions and comic book conventions in the 1980s, there was a grassroots swell at universities and at these conventions of people translating anime on VHS on the fly, doing multiple copies, and to the point where it was almost unwatchable. I mean, I remember this well. But you had these amazing shows that you were seeing just snippets of, just clips of, or just an episode here and there. But the popularity of that, I think, was demonstrating to those who were adjacent to that market, who were already producing anime for broadcast, or kind of dubbing and subbing and cutting anime into things that American broadcasters would put out on the air. They were looking at this market and seeing it start to grow. And that's where you get things like Streamline. So Streamline's a big distributor in the States. Its main person who's involved with it is Carl Maychek, I think his name is pronounced. But he works with anime historian Fred Patton and animation historian Jerry Beck when he's trying to think about what to bring over into America in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And his first big shout is Akira in 1989, alongside things like Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky, So Laputa, he brings across as well for theatrical exhibition in the late 1980s. So these kinds of companies start to build momentum, build a market in the late 1980s, early 1990s for anime. And then we get the explosion of manga entertainment, where they start out, so they're a distributor that starts here in the UK as a subsidiary of Island Records. So they kind of start to think about how to build a new market in the 1990s. And they do things like part funding anime in Japan. So Manga Entertainment famously was one of the producers behind Ghost in the Shell, the animated movie from 1995. But they also reshape the market for anime, or give it its first shape internationally for those of us who speak English, because they're doing the dubbing and the subbing. And they bring over all kinds of more extreme forms of animation, the kind of more adult forms of anime from Japan, particularly things like OVAs, so original video animations, and those kind of short series like Pat Labor they bring over. Basically, the reputation anime has in this period is as an extreme form of animation, because that's what was being brought over. And that is still lingers, I think, in the reputation of anime today.
It's hard to talk about the early popularity of anime in Western markets without talking about Akira. Even though it debuted in Japan in 1988, it wasn't released in US theaters until December 25, 1989, and it took even longer for it to reach the UK, with its theatrical release date falling on January 25, 1991. It was a pivotal film for anime in these markets, and its impact would be felt throughout the decade, as it helped to sell people on the idea that there was actually a profitable market for anime.
Yeah, so Akira came out in 1988, and at the time it was the most expensive Japanese animated film ever. And it cost 700 million yen, which equates to about $5.8 million in US money. Internationally, the film was well respected and reviewed by critics, but it wasn't until the movie came out on physical media in 1991 that the movie really took off and became what is the quintessential anime movie of all time. And a testament to this is the fact that the Criterion Collection at the time released a Laserdisc version of the movie in 1992, and this was the first time they'd released an animated film on Laserdisc as part of their collection. And so this meant at the time you could walk into almost any video rental store and find a copy of Akira on the shelf. So for many people, Akira became the gateway anime into the world of anime, and subsequently got us hooked. And I consider myself to be one of those people.
With how popular anime was becoming around the world, how big of an impact did that have on the way business was done in Japan?
I think it really varies. I think the international success of something like Akira or Ghost in the Shell was probably quite attractive in the market at the time, but that is the very pinnacle of what's going on in terms of anime production, and it's not the bread and butter of what people were doing in the studios at that time. So something like Studio Ghibli is always the exception to every rule when it comes to what anime is doing, because in the same time that the whole of Japanese culture is going through, a recession, the likes of which it hadn't seen since, the kind of post-war deprivations. Studio Ghibli is making blockbuster movies and becoming an independent studio, and building its own buildings. So there are weird kind of moments like that where investment is coming to the fore, and it's coming, and success is coming out of the groundwork that was laid in the 1980s. But I think what really changes in the 1990s is not really to do with external factors. It's much more a change towards the media mix in Japan. So the shift towards the Seisaku Iinkai, or the production committee system, where you'll bid to a manga publisher, then you get, someone on board who's going to make the DVDs, someone who's going to make the CDs, someone who's going to do merchandising, broadcasters who are going to broadcast your anime, and all of these companies come together with the anime studio as a collective to try and make sure that every individual anime that gets made is a success, that it shows everywhere in the country, that it's got DVDs in every shop, that it's got merchandise that people can buy. And that starts to drive the market in terms of new successes and new hits. So that kind of rising transmedia or like cross-media promotional strategy is maybe the biggest change. And that's how I would say the majority of anime are getting made by the end of the period. Even Studio Ghibli has the word Seisaku Iinkai in a lot of its credits, where these are the groups of people that came together to make this movie. You certainly see it in the movies from things like Satoshi Kon's movies from Madhouse. You have a production committee there. So this is kind of the new way of getting movies made. It's about looking to the home market, but looking to exploit and kind of promote the movies or TV shows as much as you can in that Japanese marketplace.
The 1990s were a rough time for many people in Japan, and for many studios in the anime industry. But despite the economic challenges, creative projects were still being made, but they went about it in a different way. Studios had to adapt to the times that they were in, and by doing so, they made an unmistakable impact that's still felt to this day.
What is completely fascinating to me, because I am a little bit of a nerd about this stuff, is how many of those companies are now begetting their own companies. So you get, let's say something like Gainax, which starts from a group of fans and is founded in the 1980s, then kind of begets its own companies. So things like Studio Trigger, that was formed in 2011, that's been formed by people who used to work for Gainax. And of course, you've got, Hideaki Anno starting his own studio as well. So we see these old studios from the 1980s and 90s now kind of starting to expand into new kinds of studios now. So the legacy of that bubble economy and that investment is still visible today in Japan's worlds of anime, which is amazing to me. But yeah, what's really noticeable about the kind of formation of these companies is there's a kind of big boom of companies making anime in the 1970s and 1980s. And that lasts for, roughly 10, 15 years. And then there's far fewer new studios in the 1990s. And then it starts to grow again across the 2000s as those older studios start to beget new studios. So some of the biggest names in anime now, companies like Studio 4C, which was formed in 1986, Studio Ghibli, Gainax, these are ones that are now the starting point for a lot of other companies that are starting to become popular.